countries. But Hinduism wasn't the only world religion to start in India. Buddhism began here too. It's based on the teachings of the spiritual leader Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha was an Indian prince born to a life of privilege around 563 BC, but he gave up his wealth and began a quest for spiritual enlightenment. After years of searching, self-denial, and meditation, it's said that Siddhartha achieved his goal. From then on, he was known as the Buddha, which means the Enlightened One. For the next 45 years, the Buddha traveled through India and brought his teachings to many people. The Buddha accepted many Hindu ideas, including reincarnation and karma. But he dismissed many others, particularly the caste system. The Buddha taught that anyone could achieve enlightenment by following a series of principles he called the Eightfold Path. Buddhism grew very popular, and its followers spread it quickly through India. Some Indian
Buddhism originated in India, but today Buddhism is nearly non-existent in the land of the Buddha's birth. Today we will examine the rise and fall of Buddhism in India.
Buddhism originated in Bodh Gaya, India in the 5th century BCE, when Siddhartha Gautama, now known as the Buddha, achieved enlightenment under a papal tree, which is now known as the Bodhi tree. After attaining enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, the Buddha set out to share his experience and teach others about the path to enlightenment. The Buddha traveled throughout northeastern India for several decades, and even converted Brahmins and other members of the nobility. The Buddha did not appoint a successor, but instead asked his followers to work towards liberation. Alongside this directive, the teachings of the Buddha only existed in oral traditions. Therefore, sectarian splits among schools of Buddhist thought were inevitable. The early schools of Buddhism developed and gained popularity regionally. The Mahayana school of Buddhist thought is prominent in China and other East Asian nations. The Theravada school of Buddhist thought is dominant in Myanmar, Thailand, and other neighboring nations. And the Vajrayana school of Buddhist thought is dominant in the country at hand, India. 5th and 6th century Indian merchants are credited with the rapid spread of Buddhism. According to historians, merchants found Buddhist teachings more useful and well-meaning than Brahmin teachings, and more inclusive of new emerging social classes, and thus adopted Buddhist practices and beliefs. During this time, the Mauryan Empire was at its height and stretched from parts of modern-day Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan in the west to parts of China in the east, and most of the Indian subcontinent. As merchants traveled throughout the Mauryan Empire and along the Silk Road, establishing commercial trading outposts, they shared Buddhism with their customers and business partners. Because of their extensive travels, merchants proved to be an efficient vector for Buddhism. While merchants traveled throughout the Mauryan Empire, Emperor Osaka declared Buddhism the state-sponsored religion of the Mauryan Empire. Emperor Osaka then went on to dedicate royal funds to the building of temples, shrines, and monasteries before his death in 232 BCE. In addition to constructing monuments, temples, and monasteries, Emperor Ashoka also sent Buddhist monks as missionaries throughout all of India, Ceylon, what today is known as Myanmar, Nepal, Tibet, Central Asia, China, and Japan. Because of the efforts of Emperor Osaka and Indian merchants, Buddhism spread throughout Central, Western, and East Asia. As Buddhism spread to lands adjacent to India, it came into contact with new ethnic groups and became subject to a variety of influences, including those of Greek and Persian civilizations. As Buddhism spread geographically, it became more and more appealing to the lower castes in India. Traditional Brahmanical religion at this time had become more and more exclusive of the lower classes and was tailored only for the Brahmins and aristocracy.
But why did Buddhism spread so quickly? Why were people so willing to adopt its practices and faith?
In such an environment, the Buddhist teachings offered an alternative to the mainstream religion that was much more appealing to the general population. This is why a majority of the Buddha's early followers were Sudras, or untouchables. In addition, the tenets and rules of Buddhism were very simple to understand, and the Buddhist preaching was usually done in the local language of Prakrit. One theory is that in the era of Buddha, India was regarded as a pioneer in many fields, including in spiritual and intellectual innovation. In this regard, India was viewed as a superpower similar to 21st century America. It is theorized Buddhism was received so well in other Asian nations because it originated in India.
Despite Buddhism's steady growth and early flourishing inside of India, a steady decline set in during the later Gupta era and under the Pala Empire from the 8th century to the 12th century CE. Historians credit both internal and external influences for the decline of Indian Buddhism. Within India, the period between 400 BCE and 1200 CE saw a shift in royal patronage from Buddhism to Hinduism, while Brahmanism once again regained popularity at the expense of Buddhism. The death of Buddhism in northern India occurred after the collapse of the Empire of Harsha in 647 CE. After the collapse of the Empire of Harsha, many smaller kingdoms arose that were typically ruled by Rajputs clans rather than the previous Buddhist ruling clans. Much of what we know about the state of Buddhism following Harsha's reign comes from the Chinese pilgrim Huanzang, who traveled widely and documented his journey. Although he found many regions where Buddhism was still flourishing, he also found many where it had sharply and startlingly declined, giving way to Jainism and a Brahmanical order. In southern and western India, Hinduism and Jainism gradually replaced Buddhism as the preferred religion of the economic and political elite in the mid-first millennium CE. Furthermore, closing of ranks between Jainism and Vedic Hinduism and a vigorous revival of Hinduism led to a sharp decline of Buddhism in the region. Gradually, Hindus and Jains occupied sites abandoned by the Buddhist Sangha. Nonetheless, it appears that Buddhism endured longer in southern India than anywhere else in India, with a greatly diminished Sangha still existing as late as 1500 CE. In the east, under the Palas in Bengal, Mahayana Buddhism flourished and spread to Bhutan. The Palas created many temples and a distinctive school of Buddhist art. Mahayana Buddhism flourished under the Palas between the 8th and 12th century, before it collapsed at the hands of the attacking Sena dynasty. One factor that contributed to the demise of Buddhism was the diminishing of Buddhism's distinctiveness with respect to the rise of Hinduism. Though Mahayana writers were quite critical of Hinduism, the devotional cults of Mahayana Buddhism and Hinduism likely seemed quite similar to the masses. Furthermore, Hinduism borrowed elements from Buddhism. In addition, the prominent 8th century CE Hindu philosopher Shankara developed a monastic order on the Buddhist model and also borrowed concepts from Buddhist philosophy. As far as external forces are concerned, Central Asian and northwestern Indian Buddhism weakened in the 6th century after the White HON invasion, who followed their own religions. Their king, Mirhakula, who ruled from 515 CE, suppressed Buddhism as well. In addition, in 711 AD, Muhammad bin Qasim conquered the Sindh region in northwestern India and southeastern Pakistan, bringing Indian societies into contact with Islam. The forces of Muhammad bin Qasim defeated regional governors easily and claimed the territory as their own. The Chachnama records many instances of conversion of stupas to mosques, as well as the incorporation of the religious elite into the ruling administration, such as the allocation of 3% of the government revenue to the Brahmins. As a whole, the non-Muslim populations of conquered territories were treated as people of the book, and granted the freedom to practice their respective faiths in return for payment of the poll tax. They were then excused from military service or payment of the tax paid by Muslim subjects. In addition, the 14th century warlord Timur conquered much of western and central Asia and founded the Timurid Empire. While ruler, Timur destroyed Buddhist establishments and raided areas in which Buddhism had flourished. Moreover, according to one theory, by the time of the Muslim conquest in India, there were only glimpses of Buddhism, nor any evidence of a provincial government in control of the Buddhists. During the 7th to 13th centuries, when Islam arrived, this theory claims that it replaced Buddhism as the great cosmopolitan trading religion in many places, accompanied by a consolidation of the communal peasant regions of Hinduism. Tibetan scholar of the 17th century, Taranatha, writes that during the time of the Sina king, Turks had begun to appear on horses and that monasteries had been fortified with troops stationed in them. However, they were overrun and monks at Udanapura were massacred, the monastery razed and replaced by a new fort. Hardly any contemporary evidence, however, exists on the destruction of Buddhist monasteries. However, many places were destroyed and renamed by Muslim conquerors. Today, only 0.8% of Indians identify as Buddhists. In the homeland of the Buddha, Buddhism barely exists. Despite these dismal numbers, Buddhism continues to live on in the form of ancient memorials and religious sites. Though Buddhism may be all but disappeared from India, it continues to flourish in other Asian nations.